institutions throughout our history. It's not the only thing we do, but as I said, I believe in terms of economic development, institutions like those you represent are very important. These are all kinds of publications that we've done in studies, case studies. All of this is on our website. You can download it or give me your card. I can send you hard copies for free. We've produced tools for anchor institutions. These are for hospitals on how to do local sourcing, local investing, local hiring in a way that can really benefit communities. We've produced a dashboard with support from the Annie Casey Foundation. You'll be hearing from Charles Ruthizer later. That is a way for anchor institutions to measure the level of impact and effort they're making on behalf of their communities. So there are lots of tools available to you. So that's one takeaway here. If people in this room decide we want to build a really powerful anchor institution collaboration in the city of Kansas City, you're standing on the shoulders of many people who've been doing this work. So you have a lot available to you. Lots of mistakes have been made. You don't need to make all those mistakes. You can make your own new mistakes to inform the strategy. So let's just start with the kind of 101. What are anchor institutions? Traditionally, they're called, we think of them as eds and meds, universities and hospitals. They're the big employers, the big purchasers. But there are many other kinds of anchor institutions. There are cultural centers, theaters, museums, like some in this area. Local philanthropy, community foundations, are constrained by their charters to focus locally. So they're not going to focus, in California if you're based in Kansas City. Faith-based institutions, obviously local government. The government of the city of Kansas City is not going to pick up and outsource itself to Phoenix. So all of these kinds of institutions have in common a couple characteristics. One is what economists call their sticky capital. Their capital, and it tends to be rooted in place. In the next 100 years, most of the businesses you can see in Kansas City are going to come and go and merge, and some will go out of business and become redundant and so forth. But you can bet that your universities, your hospitals, your city government, they're going to be here in 100 years. That's why they're called anchor institutions. They rarely get up and leave. So they can be counted on as economic engines, and that's why they're such a tremendous asset for our communities. Typically, they're nonprofit or public, not always, and because they're nonprofit or public, they have some sort of social mission, some sort of beyond profit making, something that's about delivering education to people, local residents, delivering health care, providing cultural opportunities, some sort of social mission that can be appealed to on behalf of the community. The opportunity is enormous. So these are some figures from a couple years ago. They've only grown in the United States. These are just the eds and meds, universities and hospitals. Those institutions employ over 9 million people out of a total US employment base of something like 125, 130 million people. So it's a significant part of employment. Annual expenditures, last calculation we did, economic activity of over $1.2 trillion. That's a good percentage, about 6% of the gross domestic product of the United States, locked in place in our communities, not getting up and leaving. Procurement of over $500 billion of goods and services just to keep the doors open. Investment portfolios of $750 billion. Now, most of those investments are being made on Wall Street. They're not being made with an eye to how do we invest these assets in our local community and still get a decent return. Imagine if you could start to free up $750 billion on behalf of our communities. What a game changer that could be. So the opportunity, just in terms of raw economic power, is enormous. Anchor institutions have all kinds of assets. These are some particularly related to hospitals, but not only. In the Democracy Collaborative, we particularly focus on the lower right-hand corner of economic assets. How 1,000 employees, let's say a $2 billion budget, it's one thing for that hospital to establish a little office to the side with 10 people in it to benefit the community. But there are 40,000 still doing just what they were doing. So we said, what would it look like if you could start to harmonize or leverage and focus all of the functions of an institution like a hospital, a university, a cultural center, not only to benefit the institutions, but benefit the community. If you could run your IT division in a way that is taking the community into account and trying to create value, economic value for the community. If you could run your police department, lots of institutions have their own security forces. What if you could run those in a way that benefited the community, hiring locally and so forth? And so we came up with the idea, and this was vetted with leaders of many institutions in the United States who have ascribed to this, a commitment to intentionally apply an institution's long-term place-based economic power, purchasing and so forth, and its human capital, its people, its thought leadership, in partnership with community to mutually benefit the long-term well-being of both. How do you do that? No institution in America is nearly there, so you don't need to be worried about that. But that's the aspiration of where we're going, and let me show you how one institution's thinking about it. At the Democracy Collaborative, we work with Kaiser Permanente. They're based in Oakland. It's a nonprofit. I run a nonprofit. It's about a $5 million budget. Kaiser Permanente is like a $56 billion nonprofit, so it's a little bit bigger. It's got about 188,000 employees, very big player. But it began to look at this anchor mission, said, how do we deploy all of our assets to create healthier populations, which is part of our mission, to create health in wherever our hospitals and health assets are. And so they began looking at all of these aspects. How do they invest their money? How do they run their facilities so that they're greener facilities, which is creating a healthier environment, which is intervening in the social determinants of health so that people are healthier, so they're not becoming sick and need to be treated. And so this is one way they're starting to look at everything they're doing. And that's sort of the challenge of how an institution does this. By the way, we do work in a number of different cities. I'm going to show you some in a minute. But one of them was in Rochester, New York. And I had a very interesting meeting with the C-suite leadership of the Rochester major health system in Rochester, New York. And I was asked to deliver a short presentation, and then everybody went around the table. So it's the head of dining services, the head of facilities, the head of HR and so forth, and went around the table and said, okay, we've got this frame now. How might we start to change our practices in the unit that I run so that it's more beneficial to the community? And I thought, what is he going to say about this? Is this possibly relevant, this anchor mission, to what he's doing? And he said, you know, as I listened to this, I had this thought. We have a police force of about 35 people here at our system. And essentially everybody I've hired, they're fantastic police, but they're all like me. They're all ex-New York cops who just came up here to Rochester to work. They have no connection to the neighborhoods. What if we were to create an intentional program to recruit people from the neighborhoods onto our police force? Now, they don't have policing skills, but we could train them up for that. And so we'd have more diversity in our police force, but more importantly, we'd have people on our team who understand the community and would know community residents. And if somebody was trying to get in the hospital who was kind of a bad actor, maybe they were trying to come in for the drugs or whatever, our police would actually know who those were. So we'd get the benefit of a safer hospital, and the community would get jobs and so forth. So that's the kind of thinking, even small steps like that, can make a difference in the anchor mission approach. So let me give you some examples of how this starts to play out. In California, there's a health system in San Francisco called Dignity, a Catholic health system. It's also in Arizona and Nevada. They took $100 million, just 1% of their entire endowment, their investment portfolio, and put it into a low-interest loan fund for local minority and women-owned businesses that were not considered creditworthy to be able to go to a traditional bank and get resources. So they took $100 million and they're loaning it out to local businesses that employ people in neighborhoods who need jobs. They've had a repayment rate of over 98%. So even though it's often thought these businesses are not viable, in fact, they're paying back. And they consider this part of their mission to create a healthier population by giving people jobs and better income opportunities. In Wisconsin, the Gunderson Lutheran Health System decided it wanted to go green. And so it's actually become, it's based on 100% renewable energy from the local community. They decided they wanted to serve much healthier food. They couldn't find enough food, so they began to develop, work with local farmers to produce healthier food. They set up a farmer-consumer cooperative that could produce this kind of food, again, benefiting the entire community and giving the institution exactly what it wanted. Again, this isn't charity. It had a business plan to use more local food and better energy, and it used its assets to create them. In Newark, a whole group of anchor institutions have come together with the mayor, Ross Baraka, to address the following problem. A study was done by a local think tank of the following. Of all the jobs that existed within the city limits of Newark, New Jersey, how many of those jobs were held by residents of Newark rather than residents of suburbs? What they found was of all the jobs in Newark, only 17% are held by Newark residents. So the anchor institutions, which aren't going to move, they're in it for the long term. They said, this is crazy. We've got to get people into jobs. And so they created with the mayor an initiative called Newark 2020. And they stepped forward and made public commitments of how many jobs leading up to 2020 would each institution create within their hospital, their university, and so forth, and hire directly from a community resident. And the number they came up with, 2020. Over 2,000 jobs being created in a 3 or 4 year period by local anchor institutions held by residents of Newark to address this problem of unemployment or underemployment in the city. Healthy Neighborhoods Albuquerque. Albuquerque is a very, New Mexico is a really interesting place and has one of the highest incidents of child poverty in the state. So the mayor's office, the community foundation, and the largest health system in the state, the University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center, called me one day. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, and I'm going to show you some about Cleveland. That's where we're going to end. You get to see a 2-minute video, so I'll stop talking. You'll get to see something fun. They called me one day and said, we have the highest incidence of child poverty in the country. We want to find a way to deal with that. We're interested in what you're doing in Cleveland. Can we come to Cleveland and see what you're doing? As a result, over the last 2 years, we've helped this set of anchor institutions create something called Healthy Neighborhoods Albuquerque, where they're working together to invest, to hire in specific low-income neighborhoods. And one of their strategies is to build up the local food system, because very little food in New Mexico is actually grown in New Mexico. It's all grown in California and Arizona. So all those billions of dollars keep leaving New Mexico. They want to keep the money locally. By the way, 2 of these health systems, Presbyterian Health and the University of New Mexico Health Science Center, they are fierce competitors. They do not often play well together. They're trying to get each other's doctors and nurses and patients. But they came together around this agenda. They put aside, not that they're still not fierce competitors, but they put aside their competition so they could work together on behalf of the community. And again, as a business proposition, because they think it's ultimately good for them. In Cleveland, University Hospitals, this is a facility being constructed, cancer center, had a $1.2 billion construction spend over 5 years. And typically what they would have done with that $1.2 billion is just gone to a national firm that would manage the whole process of the construction. And they would say to the firm, bring it in on time, bring it in on budget. And by the way, if you could give some contracts to some local vendors, that would be great. But it's your responsibility, not ours. University hospitals, to their credit, not because they were required to, but because out of their commitment to the community, said, we're done with that, what they called the old boys network. We're going to do this in a different way. And so over this 5 years, they set targets for how much of this spend would be spent with local firms, how many minority and women-owned firms would get contracts, and so forth. They blew through all of their targets. Their target was that 80% of the $1.2 billion would be spent in Northeast Ohio with locally owned firms in that area. They hit 92% of $1.2 billion. That's at least in Northeast Ohio. That's serious money. They had a target of, I can't remember, some dozens of minority firms participating on these projects and getting contracts either as first or second tier companies. They achieved over 100. And more than a third of those are still in their supply chain, ongoing work that they'd never been able to have before. So again, that's the way you can conduct your business in a way that they were going to build this stuff anyway. Let's just do it in this way. Rush University, some of you may have picked up on the back table. This is Rush University Medical Center. We helped them write this, what they call the Anchor Mission Playbook. It's kind of how to do this work. But this is how they think of it. They're on the west side of Chicago. I think of a neighborhood as thousands of people, maybe 10,000 people. Well, the west side of Chicago neighborhood they're focused on has 400,000 people in it. Very low income, overwhelmingly people of color. And they've decided this is how they're going to start to conduct their business. I won't go through it all, but you could see systematically they're looking at each of their functions and how to retarget this. And that book is the story of that. And then finally, before I get to Cleveland, this is Preston, England. So it's in Lancashire. It's in what we would call in the United States their Rust Belt. It was part of the Industrial Revolution. All that went away. Preston was a small city, 150,000 people. It was really flat on its back. I went there 6 years ago. Since then, but it's kind of nice to look at, isn't it? Since then, they've started, in 2013, they started an anchor strategy. These are some of their anchors. The local police constabulary became part of this, buying local, hiring local, and so forth. All of those anchors working together systematically. All of this catalyzed by the city council of Preston. So these figures, let me just describe these. This is the data they were working with. When they started this procedure, of the 6 anchors that are part of this grouping, of all their spending on an annual basis, only 5% was being spent within the city of Preston. And 61% was leaking out of Lancashire, so only 39% within the county of Lancashire. So just remember those numbers, 5% and the 61% leakage. After 4 years, they're now spending 18% of their money in the city of Preston, and only 20% is now leaking out. And you could see the figures, what that means. It means that 70 million pounds, which is not quite $90 million US, 70 million pounds that would have left the area, stayed in the area, creating hundreds of jobs, saving thousands of jobs. And in the county of Lancashire, there's an increase of 200 million pounds going into the county. So this is really serious money. And by the way, there was just a study done in England. When this began, Preston was listed in the bottom 20% of the most deprived cities in all of England. A study just came out about a month and a half ago that listed Preston as the most improved community in the entire United Kingdom in 4 years. That's the power that can come from an anchor institution strategy. So I'm going to talk about Cleveland. Thought there was another slide. So Cleveland, Ohio is where I'm living. It's not where I'm from, but I moved there 8 years ago or so to do the work I'm about to show you. Cleveland's an older industrial city. It was at one time in the 1950s, it was one of the 5 wealthiest cities in America. There were more Fortune 500 corporations headquartered in Cleveland than anywhere in the United States except Manhattan, New York City. It had a population of over 900,000 people. That was in the 1950s. Today, Cleveland is always listed as one of the 3 poorest cities in America. It's always Detroit and then New Orleans and Cleveland, go back and forth. The population's down from 915,000 to about 385,000, and there are 2 Fortune 500 corporations left. So there's been this massive kind of deindustrialization of the city of Cleveland as jobs have left, industries left, and so forth. So what you have is a city left behind where the poverty rate, about 35% of the entire population of the city lives below the federal poverty line. So it's a serious and ongoing problem. So a group of institutions came together, and my organization was part of this, to create an anchor strategy, a multi-anchor strategy. These are some of the institutions. You see local philanthropy, the Cleveland Foundation, the oldest community foundation in the country. You see some nonprofit organizations like Fairfax Renaissance and Famicos. You see the city of Cleveland. You see the large anchor institutions. And they began to go to work on a strategy together. Okay, hold on a second. So some slides disappeared. So since they disappeared, I'll tell you what it was. So if you look at the three largest anchor institutions in Cleveland, the Cleveland Clinic, University Hospitals, Case Western Reserve University, together they purchase over $3 billion of goods and services. However, they're surrounded by a set of neighborhoods of 50,000 residents, 6 neighborhoods, where the median household income is below $18,500. The federal poverty line is below $22,500. So there is a very interesting issue. You had $3 billion circulating among these world-class institutions surrounded by a sea of poverty. So obviously all that money was not hitting the institutions. Further, they looked at their employment base, and of the 50, 60,000 people that worked in the institutions, only about 3,000 even lived in Cleveland. And of those 3,000, only a couple hundred in the neighborhoods. So they started to devise a strategy called the Greater University Circle Initiative. University circles a part of the city to buy locally. So that has led to a number of things. It's led to a pipeline that has brought hundreds of residents from low-income neighborhoods who could not get even an interview for a job before, have gotten jobs within the institutions. It's led to reforms in their purchasing, so that one large contract, for instance, was given to a national firm for 10 years at $75 million a year from a hospital. And the hospital said the winning bid will not only be price competitive, but will have to agree to move into our community, not their headquarters, but open a facility and hire people locally. And so 70, 80, 100 people have gotten jobs out of that. And one thing we started was a for-profit, employee-owned cooperative business network called the Evergreen Cooperatives. And these provide goods and services to the large hospitals and institutions. We have a very large-scale healthcare bed linen laundry, doing about 30 million pounds of laundry. We have a green energy and construction company doing work for the institutions. We've created something called Green City Growers, which is growing 3 million heads of lettuce in downtown Cleveland and 300,000 pounds of basil for the local food market instead of bringing it all across the country from the West Coast. And all of this is employee-owned, worker-owned, living wages, profit sharing, benefits. Now about 250 people currently working in this. A very good percentage of them were formerly incarcerated and couldn't get into normal jobs, into the normal economy because they had a strike on their record and so forth. So there were going to be some really good slides of all those things, but I will show you a video of it. Before I do, let me just say, in addition to the work in cities, there are networks of anchor institutions that are gearing up that you might find interesting. One is called the Healthcare Anchor Network. It has in it 42 now of the largest health systems in the country. We get these systems together twice a year and doing work with them ongoingly all the time. They just met in Richmond, Virginia about a week ago. And in that room, these institutions represented over 1 million employees, over $50 billion in annual procurement, and over $150 billion in investment portfolios. They're working together on how to focus all this to create healthier communities consistent with their mission. We've just helped to begin something called the Higher Education Anchor Mission Initiative. These are over 30 urban place-based institutions of higher education doing the same kind of work. They're not quite as big, but you can see when they get together, this is what's represented in the room. Again, real economic power that, if harnessed for our communities, could make a big difference. And we've created a network that will convene in January 16th to 18th in New Orleans of collaboratives based in cities like your own, where multiple anchors are working together to address some of the problems of the community. And that may be something that some of you might be interested in. Oh, okay, so this is what got out of ours. So these are the institutions in Cleveland. This is the bad situation in the neighborhood we were trying to address. There's that, you saw. This is our green energy company. This is a 1 megawatt solar field in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Cleveland, supplying a megawatt of clean energy to the hospitals and universities. These gentlemen are the owners of this company. This is our Evergreen Cooperative Laundry. We do all of the healthcare bed linen for the Cleveland Clinic, for instance, over 20 million pounds of sheets and towels every year, as well as 8 million pounds from other systems. And this is our Green City Growers, our food production greenhouse. So that's, it's about 3 football fields in size, indoors. So I'm going to show you a 2-minute video, and then I'll wrap up, and then any questions.
I've been at Evergreen 8 years, and I've done just about every job here.
We supply linen for hospitals and nursing homes and hotels, and supply jobs for the neighborhood.
We're on time, on track. We work together as a whole team.
Now we all set, ready to go.
Our mission of Evergreen Cooperative Laundry is to serve our customers and to give a better life to our employees.
I thought life was about over for me, you know. Then this job came along, and it's been wonderful ever since.
We like to hire those people that would ordinarily not have an opportunity to find a job.
I made a mistake, but I really wanted someone to give me a second chance because I know that I had worked hard during my incarceration to become a different woman coming out than I was going in.
We also do home ownership through payroll deduction. You know, we do sharing the profits. Our mission is to create the wealth, but also to stabilize our communities.
This marks probably one of the best days in our 9-year history. We formally announced today our partnership with the Cleveland Clinic to take over operations here at their Collinwood Yards facility.
We had to find a new partner in our laundry plant. We knew that once we gave Evergreen an opportunity to come in and run the plant, they would have a vested interest because it's a job that they are part owners. So we felt like once we got them in here, they would do a wonderful job.
I was excited. Cleveland Clinic's a world premier organization, and that makes us a world premier organization.
It really speaks to the Cleveland Clinic's commitment to our community. Just within the last few months, we've added over 100 new jobs.
You always want to be able to do something bigger, and with Cleveland Clinic partnering with us, we're able to be a part of something that affects so many people.
Working here give me a different perspective of life, you know, because life is good. And there's opportunity for everyone at Evergreen to achieve.
They give them hope, they help them buy homes, they become part owner. How could you not want to support that?
My life has changed a lot in the past almost 2 years now. I look forward to getting up and coming to work every morning here.
They're part of an organization that's going to help them also create their wealth and to take care of their families.
It stabilized my life. Bought a house, able to provide for my wife and family.
It's done a lot for me. Being an owner makes me feel proud. It makes me feel like I've worked to accomplish something instead of just being stagnant.
I want to flourish, and I want everybody to see me flourish, as I want all these ladies and gentlemen here to flourish. And with Cleveland Clinic partnering with us, that's exactly what we're doing.
What's possible when anchor institutions get involved? It's not easy. It takes a lot of effort. It's not necessarily more expensive, but it does take getting a different perspective on the community and a different perspective on how you want to run your business. Evergreen is just one example of many. You're going to hear some others today. As Chantel said, this is not a silver bullet. It doesn't happen overnight. You heard Evergreen's been at it 9 years. But what is possible, if you imagine what starts to become possible as institutions start to refocus their practices in this way, is that you have an ongoing and new economic dynamic within a community. A way to think about this for me is the following. I was at one of the great hospital systems in the United States and talking to their procurement people. And I said, would you diagram for me, how do you make your procurement decisions? You know, and how do you incentivize people? And one of the ways they said is, we're committed to 20% of everything we do being green procurement. And they had very strong measures for that. And that's very laudable. And what's great about it is they don't have to fight about it every year. People don't need to pick it outside and say, you need to do more for the environment. It's just every year they do 20%. If you're a procurement officer and you want to get ahead in that hospital system, that health system, and you want bonuses and you want good write-ups in your personnel file, you have to hit that 20% figure, just end of story. And what I realized is if I had been there 20 years ago and asked them to diagram out their procurement, green procurement would not have been on that list at all. To the extent they thought about it, they would think it was way too expensive. We can't do that. But now they do. And what happened is, over time, that new idea of how to conduct their business entered the DNA of the company. So the same now needs to happen with this issue of localizing the economic power of these institutions in service of equity and inclusion and local community resilience. And over time, as that enters the structure and the DNA of companies, that will unleash tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars all over the country for things like Evergreen and some of the other things you're going to hear. So in the end, I kind of gave it away with the slide, but I always like to end with Albert Einstein, who said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. This is a new kind of thinking for institutions, and I hope some of you will find it attractive, and I look forward to responding to any questions that you may have before you listen to this great panel about how to do this kind of work that's going to be following. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm here to answer questions for a bit. Thank you. Thanks. Yes, sir. Yeah, so you're kind of addressing like a brain drain and how young people leave our cities and are we keeping them? And yeah, I do think, probably Charles Ruthiser, who will come after me, is going to be able to talk about that. I do think there have been studies like that. We haven't, as far as I know, done that in Cleveland, but what we are trying to do is in the neighborhoods, these disinvested neighborhoods, where we're citing these businesses and this kind of activity, we are trying to track what are other changes taking place in the neighborhood that is going to keep people wanting to live there. You know, when we opened the Evergreen Cooperative Laundry that you saw, we started out, we didn't have many contracts. So we had a facility that could have 50 workers, and we had 5, because that's all the contracts we had. We didn't advertise that the laundry was there. We just put up a little, you know, sign outside in this building said Evergreen Cooperative Laundry. Within the first month, 500 community residents had walked to the door and asked if there was jobs. So that's how little economic activity there is. And so our hope, while we haven't been tracking what you said, our hope is by creating economic energy and opportunity, people are going to see they could stay in these neighborhoods and they could really fight for the transformation of the neighborhood, and that's the hope. But as I said, I think Charles will probably be able to help you on that. Yes, sir.
Yes, with most of the jobs appear to be low income.
Yeah.
And, you know, considering what's happening with technology and automation, is there some strategy to try to raise the skill level of some of these workers?
Yeah.
They'll be ready for the new model?
Yeah. So the question, if you didn't hear, was when you look at the video, you see these are, you know, pretty manual labor. You know, they're not $300 an hour jobs and high-tech jobs. And so is there a strategy to move people along that? And indeed, is there a strategy to create jobs of that kind? So it is, you're exactly right. That's given the background of people and the skill set and so forth, what we've done, we have committed to paying a family supporting living wage, and we've committed to profit sharing so that people not only get an income, but get some additional assets. Our mantra in creating these jobs has been a job alone is not enough. You have to find a way to enable people to start to build wealth, even if it's modest. So the workers in the laundry that you saw, we had a profit sharing event earlier this year, and the people who have been there the longest got $5,000 checks as bonuses, which in a neighborhood where the median household income is $18,500 is a very big deal. We do have a number of our people are moving up into supervisory and other roles. People are being trained in computer skills, and the greenhouse, you didn't really see, but it's actually highly automated, lots of computers, and so people are learning those kind of skills. We have other companies in the pipeline that are being developed that have more of the kind of jobs you're talking about that are, again, not designing, the next Google, but that are more technology, computer-based, information technology kind of jobs. And then we also have an additional strategy we've just built, which is that we've established the Evergreen Employee Ownership Fund. And we have $5 million in it. We're looking for other investors. And the idea is this, that in any city, Cleveland or Kansas City, because of what's called the silver tsunami, which is people with hair color like mine who are nearing retirement, millions of business owners are going to be retiring in the next decade. And the question becomes, what happens to those companies, and how do you retain those jobs and make them good? And if the kids don't want the company, and lots of kids have left, you tend to sell it to a competitor, and people inevitably lose their jobs. So this employee ownership strategy is to take existing businesses as a succession plan, buy them, sell them into an employee ownership structure so that the jobs are retained and people benefit even more. And a number of those kinds of jobs are higher technology jobs. But you're right, that's what's new. We don't want this strategy to just be move people into lower wage jobs. That's not what this is about. This is about building wealth in our communities. Yes?
So you talked about kind of community examples and where you've seen, some turnaround, job growth.
Yeah.
It just kind of reminded me of a little bit of the dialogue we're coming to happening with national policy, and we need to stop the trade deficits nationally and stop creating jobs in Canada, Mexico, China, and creating all the wealth there, but focusing nationally. Do you see that policy as kind of a natural extension of what you're talking about at a community level?
No, I think it's a very different policy. So not to get into politics, this is not a Trump make America great again kind of strategy. This is how do we swing the pendulum back a bit, which is the pendulum has gotten so far away from community, and so many of the economic decisions have left the hands of our communities. How do we get some more resources back in and rebuild the very basis of community? It's also very much an environmental strategy. The greenhouse is in Cleveland in Northeast Ohio. If you're eating leafy greens any time of the year except August, that lettuce is coming from California or Mexico or Arizona. And all of that's being transported with 1,200 or 1,500 miles of carbon-based transportation. So we're trying to also mitigate against some of these environmental problems that are at a distance and bring it back closer. But I don't see this as it's Cleveland against Pittsburgh, against Detroit. I think it's more, how do we start to build stronger, vibrant communities? And obviously these contracts will continue to go all over the place, but there's a lot that could be done locally. And so for me at least, I think it's a very different spirit. And I think it produces much better results than the current way of handling our local economies. Chantel? Okay, you're the first one. You gotta hold it, I think. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Well, so this gets to the question of what is an anchor institution. And there's some debate about that. I have a good friend who is in philanthropy who continues to argue that, pro sports teams, like football teams, are anchor institutions because they're based here. But being in Cleveland, I remember the day when the Cleveland Browns picked up and moved to Baltimore. So the question is, how do you define an anchor institution and have it rooted? And for me, it has to do about the ownership being locally residing in this sort of sunk capital cause and not having its economic decisions controlled by outside investors who will be seeking inevitably to maximize, in some sense, shareholder value. And if it's better, therefore, to pick up and leave, that would be a rational decision. So that's why we tend in the anchor world to focus on nonprofit and public hospitals, universities, cultural centers, city governments, and the like. That said, I do believe that a lot of companies, particularly larger companies that have a legacy, historic legacy of being based somewhere, can exhibit a lot of anchor-like behavior. So one of the large companies that remains in Cleveland is Sherwin-Williams, which is a paint company. Now, Sherwin-Williams could decide tomorrow to move anywhere it wants, and no one's going to stop them. But they've been in Cleveland 100 years plus, and they have a commitment locally, and so they do a lot of things that benefit the local community. And I think all that should be encouraged. And Evergreen has partners that are corporate partners. But if you're building a strategy for the long haul for your local economy, in my view, it makes a lot more sense to have it overwhelmingly based on the big nonprofit and public institutions that are going to be there, rather than the sort of generosity of some companies, but that could go away. But I do think there's a role for them to play. I don't mean to make them out to be the bad guys. I think they can be good partners in all this. Yes? You holding down your button? Okay, it's a test. Well, almost. Just keep holding while you talk. It'll turn green. Yay. Sure. Yeah. So if you remember, so this is a work in progress. So I don't think right now there are the absolutely defined tools. But if you remember very early on when I first showed some slides, we published this and we do that. There was one about the fourth slide, it's called the Anchor Dashboard. And that was an effort where our organization, the Democracy Collaborative, in interviews with 60 or 70 institutions around the country and 20 or 30 community-based organizations that have been in some partnership with anchors, to see how do we start to measure two things. The level of effort taking place inside. You know, when we started, 90% of our contracts left the region, and after 5 years, it's down to 82%. So you could actually chart what's going on. But equally, or maybe even more important, what is the impact of all this work that's having on the local community? Is there less crime? Are more people getting jobs? What's happening with income equality and so forth? So there is a group of universities in particular that have been for the last several years using that tool and refining it. Again, Charles, who's intimately involved with Annie Casey, could talk about this more, to start to now collect data. And they've been doing it for, I think, 2 years, to see are things starting to change in the community. And by the way, the change could be good, like X number or more people have jobs or unemployment dip this percentage, or it could be bad. You could be, as an anchor institution, making tremendous investments in the local community, the end result of which is the whole real estate market starts to take off, housing prices go up, values, rents, and people that lived there in the bad times get pushed out and displaced. So that's a whole other side of this. And one of the sort of nasty stories of some of these anchor strategies is even if we credit everybody was doing things for the very right reason, sometimes there are these unintended consequences, and your very success at creating what most people would look at and say is a better place ends up being a failure, at least for the people who used to live there. So monitoring that dynamic is also very important. But there are initial tools, and they're available to you if you want to go down that path. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Yep. You need a PhD to make the thing work. That's the thing. But this is the Federal Reserve Bank. Come on. Okay. Yep. Yep. So it's a great question. If anyone couldn't hear it, it was about, given the correlation between, what occurs in very early life and reading skills and so forth, to where you end up in life, in terms of whether it's incarcerated or jobs or so forth. Are the institutions doing anything about that? What I've focused on is adults of some age getting jobs. But what about at the earlier part of this? So Evergreen per se is not doing a lot on that, although in Cleveland there's a lot of work from some of the institutions I'll describe. But there are a number of examples around the country, like the University of Pennsylvania, which is adjacent to West Philadelphia, which is historically African-American, low-income community, which started a university community school in the neighborhood for residents of the neighborhoods to assist them. The same is happening at Drexel in Philadelphia, where there's especially universities, avowedly focusing on early childhood education and opportunity and so forth. In Cleveland, one of the very interesting things that the two hospitals have done is create a community training center called the Newbridge Center for Arts and Technology. And they helped endow it with the Cleveland Foundation. And it's open to young people who are residents of the neighborhoods who come in, and this is more like junior high school kids in high school, but who come in not to learn reading and writing, but who get all kinds of new skills, learn skills of photography and of hip-hop music production and writing and fashion. And so there's an attempt to give young people both something to do rather than be on the street, but also new kinds of skills that could be marketable going forward. But again, there are a number of universities that are partnering with communities on these very educational things that you said. So again, in my organization, we tend to focus particularly on hiring, purchasing, and investment, but there are many other aspects of this for a holistic strategy. Yes, in the red.
Okay. I represent a community health center here in Kansas City with a 50-year history. As much as we wish we were the size of some of the organizations that you've talked about with the resources that they have as an anchor institution, like a Kaiser Permanente or something like that, we don't have those resources. We just aren't that. Yep. Has there been anything to suggest that an anchor partnership, an anchor coalition could be effective? People were to pool resources for buying power, things like that, in a community like ours.
Yeah, and you've put your finger actually on what I think is the most encouraging development in the anchor movement, if you will. It started with individual institutions like the University of Pennsylvania or like the University of Cincinnati doing specific things in the neighborhoods right where they were. The new development, and this has been growing and is very, very exciting, is multiple anchors of different sizes sitting around the table working together on shared strategies. I showed you one slide of what we call the Anchor Collaborative Network, this group of 25, 30 cities that's going to be meeting in New Orleans in January. Those are city-based efforts. There'll be 4 or 5 representatives from each city that are multi-anchor efforts. So if you remember the slide from Albuquerque, you had the public school system, which purchases a lot of food. People don't often think of it as an anchor, but it's not going away in Albuquerque. There's the community college, which is fairly big, but doesn't have a lot of resources, doesn't have endowments and all that. There are the 2 big health systems. There's a smaller health system involved. There's the community foundation, all working together to find that synergy. So that's, I think, if you were going to do something in Kansas City beyond what you're already doing, and I know there's good work going on, it would be creating a table around which anchors with a sort of perspective of this anchor mission, how do we focus in this way, can sit together and kind of everybody gets to be part of the conversation. Just because there's a hospital that's a $2 billion hospital and there's your community health clinic, you all have something to contribute. In Cleveland, one of the things we found is in terms of hiring, all the different health systems and smaller ones and so forth, we're all hiring people to do kind of the same job, but each system called it a different kind of job. They had different names for it. And just all deciding, let's all agree we're going to call that job this thing, created whole new recruitment opportunities for them. So there are lots of ways to work together, and it doesn't all require money. The big institutions have a lot of money to put into this in different ways because of their purchasing, Cleveland Clinic's purchasing something like $1.5 billion of goods and services. But smaller institutions have a really important role to play, and I would encourage that diversity of anchors coming together. Yes? The magic button. If you master this, you could be eligible to be the chief of staff in the White House.
There we go. Big fan, love anchor institution strategies. And, you mentioned at the beginning that plenty of mistakes have been made, so look at your material so you can make new mistakes. Can you share, a couple big mistakes?
Yeah, I can. So, and these are mistakes like, I'm old enough that I remember in the early 60s, watching the black and white TV, and NASA would try to shoot a rocket to go around the Earth, and then, 5 in a row would explode on the launch pad. There wouldn't be any people in them, they'd just explode. But it's in service to getting somewhere, so those mistakes are really useful. So I consider them the same kind of mistakes. I think one, and it still is made in many places, is that because in some ways an anchor institution is kind of inherently top-down. It's big elite institutions, and then there's community residents in need. And the mistake is and it's difficult often to have productive dialogue between institutions and residents. There's a history of suspicion from many residents who just think the institutions are out to grab the land and pave over everything, put in parking lots and get rid of people. The institutions don't feel the love from their folks and feel, they're always like hammering us for things. And there's, the power imbalance is enormous, right? So a big mistake is if this becomes, we're going to do something to the community, even if it's for the community, there needs to be some space of real co-creation and dialogue, or it just won't work and isn't sustainable. So that's one. I also believe that in multi-anchor collaboratives of the kind I was just speaking with the gentleman back there in red, while all the institutions need to be invested in this, at the most senior level and then in other levels, if there's not one really catalytic agent among those institutions that says, everybody else has got so much work, they're all going to go back to their silos, even though they're bought in. Somebody needs to be the champion that every day is trying to catalyze this, and every morning is waking up and saying, well, what do we do next? And without that sort of catalytic agent, particularly early on, I've seen really well-constructed collaboratives just kind of, dissipate because they're not being driven. Another mistake is to think that if you get the CEO bought in of the hospital, the president of the university, and so forth, that that's sufficient. It's absolutely necessary, in my view. Now, my colleagues may have different views when they tell their story. My view, you've got to get the CEO committed, and hopefully committed publicly and on videotape, right? But it's not sufficient. So we had situations in Cleveland where the CEO of an institution would say, if you build this laundry, this is before we built it, we will give you millions of pounds of sheets. You can count on it. And he meant it. This wasn't fantasy. So then you build it, and then will they come? And then what you find out is 4 rungs down from the president is the legal department, who are looking at the contracts and say, hey, we are in an ironclad contract for the next 8 years with this large multinational firm. There's no way we can do that. So, a mistake is made. One is a mistake made if you don't get the CEO on board, but the mistake is also if you think that's enough, because if you think of your institutions, and many of your institutions have many thousands of people working in them, it's almost like a community organizing strategy, and each institution is a community. There's the broader community that this is really all about, but that hospital is a community, and it needs to be organized at all levels. So HR people need to be gotten on board, communications people, the treasury people. So in Cleveland, we have a certain structure where the CEOs are part of a level that sets broad guidance for the strategy. But then there's a committee on local hiring, local purchasing, local investing, building local culture, and that's all populated by other people at different rungs of the institutions, as well as community representatives from community development corporations and so forth. So that's just some of them. In terms, last thing I'd say, in terms of these businesses, I have zero business background before helping to start this. As one of the heads of the hospital said, what do you know about business development? You're just a do-gooder. And I kind of laughed at him at the time, and then I realized he was right. When you're trying to build like a 3.5-acre hydroponic year-round greenhouse that's very technical, I don't know how to run one of those. And in fact, at the neighborhoods where we're trying to hire people, no one there knows how to run one of those. So you've got to find the right actual business and technical skill to make these things work, because they're for-profit businesses with a social mission. And if you can't make the for-profit business work, the social mission goes away. So those are, but we could go out for beers and I could regale you with 100 of them. But we're still standing. And most small businesses in America are gone in the first 5 years, and we weathered the storm. Chantel, how are we doing? Ooh, the pressure's on. Yep. Okay.
Okay, there we go. Okay. So I actually have 2 questions.
Oh.
One is what
2
role...
last
already.
Yeah. We'll have to get you later. She's got the button. And she has the last question.
Oh, okay. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
Chris.
All right.
You had a chance.
But you and I could caucus. Okay, go for it.
Okay, so quick question, and I think it's a little different from most that have been asked, which is that the examples that you've shared are mostly about hospitals and hospital systems, and maybe there's a sense that it's an easier lift for them mission-wise because of the, health being their primary imperative, and you can make that link to healthy communities pretty quickly. How's it different in the higher ed sector, and then what do you see there in terms of differences between the hospital systems and higher ed institutions?
Yeah. So, yeah, I realize I actually didn't mean to make all the examples hospitals, but I did, so you're paying attention. You get a gold star. Well, one thing, hospitals are just, among anchor institutions, they're just much bigger in terms of employment base and investment and so forth. So one thing, they're just bigger. The second, you're quite right that because hospitals, at least the ones that are enlightened, and that's most, health systems are thinking about the social determinants of health and know that what adds up to our health, only about 20% is related to quality of care and access to care. And so this other 80% is about income and neighborhoods and lead. And so it makes sense for them, it's logical to intervene with their resources. That said, we're finding tremendous interest in higher education about this. In fact, the modern anchor movement actually began in higher ed, and then it sort of morphed over to health, and then health systems have kind of taken the lead. Higher education, when it began, was much more about community service in terms of engagement, community-based research, but now increasingly, particularly in a group of about 100 urban-based universities. They're part of something called the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities, CUMU. We partner with them on this higher education network, so that 30-some institutions that we're starting to work with, they're all CUMU members, and they all understand their role as sort of economic engines within their communities. So I think that, in my view, some of this thinking is more advanced in the health sector, but it's growing rapidly in higher education. I think the next one that's really starting to get traction is within the cultural centers, museums, arts institutes, and so forth. There's a lot of new action in those. Now, they're not as big, but they also reach many, many people. So, Chantal, is that it? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
So 'tis the season for giving, but I don't think anybody was trying to give me a Lincoln. So if anybody lost keys, I have them. It's a Lincoln, and it was left at security. So, and it has a DB keychain. So unless somebody was giving me this for Christmas, you lost your keys, I have them in the back. Or must be present to win. Once again, just want to go over how to utilize the microphones. We do have people on live stream, so we do want to make sure that they're hearing your questions. There is a button at the bottom that says push. That will turn it green, so just hold it until it turns green. Voila. It's not this button. I've seen a few people trying to click this button, but the button is at the bottom, so once it's live, especially with us having a panel come up, you want to make sure that your microphone is on. And if anyone is still looking for a seat, there are 6 seats at the front of the room. So if you want to make your way to a seat, we do have a few more seats at the front of the room. We will continue with our program. So next up, we will have our panel. And I will introduce today's moderator, who is Charles Ruthizer. He told me to think of Budweiser, so Charles Ruthizer. Charles is a senior associate at the Annie E. Casey's Foundation Center for Civic Sites and Community Change. He manages national grant portfolios on anchor institutions and housing and serves on the Casey's Baltimore Civic Site team. Prior to working with Casey, Charles directed the graduate program in applied anthropology at Georgia State University and taught cultural anthropology at Johns Hopkins University and Western Michigan University. Charles' publications include 2 books, The Opportunity Makers, The First Half Century of Sponsors for Educational Opportunity, and Imagineering Atlanta, the Politics of a Place in the City of Dreams, as well as numerous articles, reports on urban inequality. He is the founding co-chair of the Anchor Institution Funders Group of the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, and a founding member of the Funders for Housing and Opportunity, as well as serving on the boards of the Mount Vernon Place Conservancy in the Art of Leadership, a leadership development program for high school students in Baltimore. Please help me welcome Charles Ruthheiser as he welcomes our panelists.
There it is. Yeah. Hey, hopefully it'll stay. And it's very powerful, so I could put this further away. So yes, I'm a recovering academic. No one in philanthropy actually, I think, thinks about going into philanthropy. We sort of gravitate into it. And the irony of that I have a grant portfolio that has me deal with institutions of higher education every day, the irony on that is not lost to me. You could leave the academy, but the academy always stays with you in some way. And thank you. And let's see, do we have the? Let's see. Okay. Oh, that's the video. That's the video. Okay. Sorry. Yes, we will have a slide at a certain point. But yeah, so I don't know how many of you know anything about the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And we're a foundation that's focused first and foremost about improving outcomes for kids. So how did we get into being interested in anchor institutions? Well, about 20 years ago, we realized that we couldn't achieve our mission of creating brighter futures for kids unless they lived in strong, supportive communities. So we began a lot of community development work, community change efforts, initiatives, and so forth. And one of the things that we quickly realized was that in many communities that we were working, there was a large university or hospital that was there in or adjacent to the community, but might as well have been on Mars. It was completely separated, removed, separated from the social and economic fabric, and highly problematic. So we began to think about what we might be able to do to be able to change that dynamic, inspired by what was going on in Cleveland, inspired by what was going on at the University of Pennsylvania. And so we developed a major initiative that focuses on four major things. One, investing in research to make the business case for anchor institutions and about anchor effectiveness. Two, about advocating for policies at the local, state, and federal levels, but especially at the local level, to help encourage and make it possible for anchor institutions and to work in this way. Supporting demonstration projects in particular places around the country where all this great knowledge and experience was coming to roost, and then spending a good deal of time and effort and resources in helping to forge networks, build networks, and build the field through conferences, learning collaboratives, and the like. And the fellow members of the panel today are all members of collaborative enterprises and initiatives that the Casey Foundation has been a co-investor in. And it's really great to have you here and have them here today and share, all of their evidence and especially the experience they've generated in doing work that is incredibly important, rewarding, but also extremely challenging. So Janice Shep, immediately to my left, is the Vice President of Operations and Strategy at the Health Foundation of South Florida. Kurt Sommer is the Director of the Baltimore Integration Partnership, a network of anchor institutions in the city of Baltimore, moving towards economic inclusion. And Patrick Horvath is Deputy Vice President of Programs and the Director of Economic Opportunity at the Denver Foundation. So what we're going to do today is we're going to try to make this somewhat conversational, and we've developed a set of questions that I will pose to the panelists, and we'll sort of do this in a kind of round robin. And we have, I think, about 5 or 6 questions. And then we will turn it around and open it up to you and be able to have you pose questions to us, and perhaps us pose questions to you as well about what you would like to be able to be seeing here in Kansas City, the work that is already going on the ground. And let me just sort of kick it off here and by an initial question. in terms of what's the focus of your collaborative? And why don't we start with Janice?
Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here this morning. Thank you to Chantal and the Federal Reserve of Kansas City for the invitation. I guess it just wants to be read. Can you all hear me? I'll use Charles. Yeah, whatever. I'll use Charles. This is what a collaborative means. So I would say the goal for the collaborative currently is to make it to Ted's presentation. As you can see, we were not a case study yet. I have to say that we currently do not have what we would call a formal network or collaborative where we have memorandum of understandings or any signed pledges. We have what I would call as an informal network of stakeholders within several anchor institutions and community partners, including banks and other funders, that have come together to figure out how we move this work in our region. In terms of the focus, we have spent the last 2 years trying to determine whether forming a formal network makes sense. We did a feasibility study in partnership with the Democracy Collaborative to better understand where the institutions in our region were with regard to some of their organizational practices and policies. We came to this journey, I think, Ted mentioned the social determinants of health. We are a health foundation. Our mission is to improve health. And we recognized early on that we couldn't achieve our mission, similar to Annie E. Casey, if we did not address the issues that really are at the root cause, including economic mobility. And we've been seeing the prosperity gap widening in South Florida. So the collaborative currently, we're launching formally in the first quarter of next year. I would say the focus has 4 pillars. Similar to what Ted mentioned earlier, their focus was. It includes procurement, local procurement, small business ecosystem, and building that ecosystem. There's also the local hiring aspect in terms of building workforce pipeline programs that go back to the underserved communities. I remember when we first met with one of the COOs at our hospital system, is like, well, this is about hiring local. It's like, well, we already hire local. So there's a lot of increasing awareness about what this work is about, which I'll talk about a little bit in the challenges. The other 2 pieces I would say are more long-term. This community investment piece where we're looking at how endowments can be used to invest local in communities is probably the hardest one, I think, to move forward with. These institutions obviously are doing some activity in procurement and hiring. The point being, how can we be more strategic, collaborative, and intentional? But at least they're doing some work and there's some infrastructure to work with. Community investment, at least in our region, none of the institutions have been looking at how they can invest in the small business ecosystem, perhaps through community development financial institutions, for example. And the other piece which we have been focusing on is community benefit. Nonprofit hospitals, as you probably know, have this as part of their Charity Care Act because of the tax exemptions that they receive as nonprofit hospitals. They need to provide some type of community benefit. Historically, that has been in the form of charity care. And with the Affordable Care Act, there was an opportunity to really look at how these community benefit resources could be used for things like supporting workforce development, economic development, and other community building activities. And that's how we came about to this work.
So, Kurt, if you also could talk a bit about the focus and how the BIP actually came about.
Sure. So good morning. It's great to be here in Kansas City. Really just to compliment the city in many ways. I haven't been here in about 15 years, and it's amazing what's unfolding in town, and just fantastic reinvestment in every corner that I've seen. So really nice to be here in town. So my name is Kurt Sommer. I'm the director of the Baltimore Integration Partnership. We are an 8-year-old collective impact initiative. We were launched 8 years ago this month as part of the Living Cities Integration Initiative. We moved forward 3 portfolios of work. Were proposed 2 at the time, of a portfolio focused on workforce development in parts of Baltimore City, capital reinvestment, We brought the Reinvestment Fund, a CDFI, in from Philadelphia to expand their lending operations into Baltimore. And then we began the anchor institution strategy, starting with Johns Hopkins University and Maryland Institute College of Arts, who were one of our initial founding partners. Our work was quite successful in the first round as we focused in on capital and workforce. The anchor strategy was very slow going. We had a good range of success in moving development projects forward with the Reinvestment Fund. We helped support through the partners placement of over 800 people into jobs, had a range of job training and workforce services that were provided to area residents. But what we kept finding was that there was more people looking for employment than we could generate directly. And so we dug in deeper to the anchor institution agenda after our first 3 years, growing from 2 institutions to then 8 to now 14 institutions. Our agenda is focused in on jobs and connecting low-income, predominantly African-American residents to economic opportunity. And we're very intent on who we're trying to serve in our mission, because that work guides your strategies going forward. In Baltimore, like Cleveland, like parts of Kansas City, there are significant disparities in economic opportunity. African-American residents in 2016 had an unemployment rate of 13.4% compared to 3.4% for white residents. If African-American residents had the same unemployment rate and labor participation rate, there would be 47,000 additional individuals working in Baltimore City. So we've been trying to be as intentional as we can about our strategies, which guide forward how we leverage the hiring power, the purchasing power, and the reinvestment powers of the 14 institutions that we're working with. Very quickly, they all have very different business models. Hospitals can do a lot more with local hiring. They have more entry-level jobs, career ladders, career pathways. Higher education institutions, they have some opportunities, but there's less turnover, and it depends on the size of the higher education institution. Smaller entities have more purchasing in line with the small business community. And so we're finding that there is definitely opportunities of collaboration and advantages of putting multiple institutions together of different types and different business models to achieve scale. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later.
So again, echoing Kurt's thanks for being here in Kansas City. Still trying to recover from the barbecue last night. I think I got I won't be eating meat the rest of the month. But we had a nice gathering of our panel participants to chat a little bit and enjoyed some Kansas City flavor. So the Denver Foundation is a community foundation. We don't have that in our name, but we are, as the community foundation model is all over the country, that we are one of those. Our focus, so we're in between Janice and Kurt. So we're formally launched, but we're not 8 years in business, and we don't have the sort of level of very specific and structured outcomes that Kurt's been talking about. Probably 2 years in, we have a catchy name, the Denver Anchor Network, or DAN. Actually, Charles gave us that name. We were the Denver Anchor Learning Network, which was down, which didn't make any sense. So we do have the list of participants that you see up on the screen. The focus of the work is very, much in line with what Ted talked about, local hiring, local procurement, local investment. We have added a very specific focus on racial equity that is beginning to move out into our network in very specific ways, and those conversations are difficult conversations with those groups that you see up on the screen there, and we're trying to find very intentional ways of having that conversation. In terms of how we came about, the Denver Foundation's Economic Opportunity Program area is only about 7 years old. 6 years old, and that itself came about because of a community conversation that we had when we were last redoing our strategic plan. And one of the things that came out of that was a strong set of information from the community saying that the access to economic opportunity in the Denver area was really uneven, and that there were many communities that were really struggling. It wasn't a huge surprise, but workforce attainment and disinvested communities were heavily on people's minds. So we began fresh back in 2013 to think about how to implement the community's goals and economic opportunity, and came across community wealth building, frankly. We didn't stumble on it, but it was part of our research. And we've taken a couple groups to Cleveland. You'll find that if you really want to accelerate the learning of your folks, visiting people who are farther along is a way to do it. And Greater University Circle Initiative, with the addition of a heavy commentary from the Neighborhood Connections program, which was the really colorful symbol you saw in the middle of Ted's slide of participants, was really, really important to us. We have a program that I ran for many years called the Strengthening Neighborhoods Program, which is very similar to Neighborhood Connections. And it focuses on small grants in neighborhoods, working with community members on issues that they identify as most important. And it starts from the ground up. And so we had that orientation to begin with, and the Neighborhood Connections element of Cleveland's work was really important to us as well. So that's how we came together, looking at it from our community investment work at the neighborhood level. And that was has continued to be a really important part of our work going forward. We have a partner in this work, which is Mile High Connects, a transit equity collaborative. So what really launched the collaborative nature of our network, or our network, was the fact that we began to think about institutions along the newly developing transit lines in Denver. We're at the tail end of a $7.6 billion surface light rail investment, tax-sponsored investment. And so working with that group, which sits at the Denver Foundation, to understand how transit plays a role in access to employment, and how many of the institutions that are now part of our anchor network are along transit lines or on high-frequency bus routes, was an important organizing concept for us.
So can you tell us a bit about how your collaborative works, or is structured, what it does, or what it hopes to do, or what it might be doing in the years to come? And we could do it down this way, or anyone who would come back, feel inspired.
So the structure that we have right now, and it's kind of shifting and getting a little bit more formal coming into 2019 as well, is that it really is a learning collaborative. That's why we originally had the name L in it, Denver Anchor Learning Network. We're trying to use the groups that are farther along. When Chantel gave her introduction, she talked about Lily Marks, a governor of the Federal Reserve here in Kansas City, who, I mean, we are part of the Kansas City Fed in Denver. So she moved, she comes out here for the meetings, and she represents that part of the district. She was very influential, partly because of a trip to Cleveland, and talking with her peers in the Cleveland Clinic and other healthcare institutions in the Greater University Circle Initiative, in helping to launch a program at the Anschutz Medical Campus, which is where many of the medical institutions, the most significant medical institutions in our community, have relocated to just to the east of Denver, on a decommissioned Army base. And it is now just an absolute hub in a pretty low-income community. And so we began working with that group of institutions in something called the Community Campus Partnership, under that Lily was heavily endorsed, and then began to think about how we can use that experience at the Community Campus Partnership to help other institutions in this emerging network to understand what their role might be. So the structure has really been about bringing that learning in, and then bringing in some national folks to talk to other folks in our network. We brought in the Vice Provost of Drexel University, which has done amazing work and has a very strong, from its very top level, the president of the university, commitment to investing in West Philadelphia. We brought in Democracy Collaborative's research director to meet with our local officials and the institutional leaders. We had a couple of high-level convenings. And so out of that, we began to pull people into this idea, and then we had this great example of a network that was, an anchor an anchor set of institutions that was working hard at this and learning things about how it applied in the Denver region, that we could then use to sort of show folks how to do this in their work too. So we brought people to the campus, at the Anschutz campus, to see how they were doing their local hiring. That set some light bulbs out. So it's very much been about a learning network. And then we've also been working through Charles's assistance to get our folks plugged into some of these national networks as well, which has been a super important part of this. So we have folks, we sent a delegation to the CUMU conference, as he referenced, the Coalition of Urban and Metropolitan Universities, their big meeting in Chicago, which now has a whole separate anchor track each time they gather. So we've sent people to that for learning. We've sent people to the Anchor Network gathering that was in Baltimore, and that's going to be repeated in New Orleans in a couple of weeks. And so getting people a chance to meet with their peers around the country has also been an important part of our structure. And now we're going to be building in some more intentional ways for them to gather in Denver and learn from each other in focus groups that line up with particular areas of interest. So for instance, we are having trouble getting C-suite buy-in. All right, let's get the 3 groups that are really struggling with that issue together and help problem solve on that. We also have a very strong coaching element to our work as well as part of our structure, where we can have folks who really understand this work and do it well go into individual institutions that are part of the network and help them problem solve for the particular thing that they're having the most difficulty with.
So the integration partnership has 14 institutions. We also have a range of public, nonprofit, philanthropic partners that help us move the work forward. The work is organized with a governance board, a representative from each institution that has committed to guide the work of their institution forward, as well as help guide the initiative forward and be an advocate for economic inclusion across the city. We also have 2 active work groups similar to the Cleveland model, a work group focused on local purchasing and small business development, and work group focused on local hiring and workforce development. Each of the work groups contains a range of community and business partners that can help the institutions succeed in their work. For example, in Baltimore, there are more than 50 public and nonprofit workforce development and training organizations whose mission is to prepare and train individuals for jobs in the private sector and within the institutions. Those organizations are amazing bridges to help the institutions find qualified workforce candidates for their jobs. And some of the work has led to new partnerships and new arrangements with the nonprofits, helping prepare individuals for jobs directly within the institutions. Similarly, in the local purchasing small business development work group, we have members of the Chamber, City Small Business Resource Center, representatives from the city's economic development arm. There's an organization that focuses it on food. There's an organization that focuses it on products made in Baltimore. So assembling those organizations that can help the institutions build that bridge between where there is economic opportunity and where there is community opportunity. So the board convenes about 6-7 times a year. The work groups once every 2 times, or once every 2 months approximately. And then we do a mix of education and policy and research and data, as well as implementation strategies. The work is structured whereas the institutions and the nonprofit partners and the public partners are the implementers. Staff, myself, tends to be the convener, the advocate, the safe advocate, helping institutions move their work forward, helping build bridges. But we turn to the partners, the institutions, to be the implementers so that they can ultimately own the work and carry the work forward. We find that in every strategy, not every institution can apply. It doesn't apply to all the institutions because of the various different business models. Over the last year, we had 3 distinct local purchasing strategies. One, a big reverse vendor fair with the city chamber focused on upcoming contracting opportunities the large institutions had. We had one focused on local food, where we had 7 institutions initially start, and then one focused in on products made in Baltimore City, where we had 6 or 7 institutions take an assertive role. So different size strategies for different size institutions and needs. I would say the collaborative tries to find that right balance between demand side strategies, working with the institutions, but also supply side strategies. Just directing spend to a business doesn't necessarily yield success for that business, particularly when the business community may be much smaller. And so you have to think about what are those strategies, what are those supports, what are those ecosystem needs on the workforce side and on the small business side for this work to succeed. Do you have to create a new job training program to fit the job types that an institution has? Do you have to help small businesses access capital, help them develop a business plan, help them think about, if they're in the food space, what do they need to do to get into a kitchen that's appropriately certified to provide food that's produced at scale that would fit the institution's buying needs. So lots of different ways to think about the work, but we're finding that to move forward demand-side strategies, you also have to have supply-side strategies. And then I noted before the advantages of different size institutions. We're also finding that the institutions are catalytic. They can be the core buyers for an initiative, a strategy, but it's also an opportunity to tap into the private sector buyers as well. We've done strategies around food, and we'd have the institutions, the food service providers as core participants in that effort, but we'd also reach out to hotels, restaurants, catering organizations, wedding planning venues, because there are businesses that don't fit the business model of the institution. And you shouldn't think about excluding them, and there's an opportunity to bring in other buyers, depending on the strategy, that can fit the business needs or profile of that smaller business. So I'll stop there.
So as an emerging network, the structure that we're thinking about will potentially replicate what we've seen in Baltimore and Denver, in the sense that we definitely want to have the leaders of these institutions, sort of a leaders council, to come together at least twice a year to ensure that we have that CO buy-in. But I guess I wasn't listening to Ted when he was talking about mistakes, that CO buy-in is not enough, even though I have two of them on video. But obviously, we do want to have work groups that will obviously move the work forward. I mean, we know that there are individuals within these large institutions that are the ones that are going to be doing the day-to-day work. So we have decided that our entry point to the anchor strategy will be focused on procurement / small business capacity building and hiring. And I think there's also some momentum around community benefit. I believe there was a question earlier about all of these case studies being, hospitals and not so much universities. And what's been interesting, I think, for the Health Foundation is that we thought that it would be easier to make the business case to the hospital systems because of everything that's happening with value-based reimbursement, et cetera, and moving to population health. And our hospital systems are just not there in our region. And it's been a university that has actually been what I call our star anchor institution, and has been really paving the way and being that leader, that early adopter of the anchor mission. In terms of what we're currently doing, the activities that we've been doing for the past 2 years, obviously, I think a lot of what's been said already, the convenings have been key. One of the things that we had as a goal was to link the community economic development sector with the healthcare, public health sector. Those two sectors are now at least knowledgeable of each other, and we have been able to increase the relationships, the partnerships, which have led to some innovative projects being piloted. We have also been supporting some of the research. So not just did we do the feasibility study with Democracy Collaborative so that we could better understand where institutions were and where we were as a community. When we are able now to say $3 billion are procured by our local anchor institutions, that sparks interest. So I think that's key to when you're starting this type of work, having that type of statistic. But we've been also looking at research that would evaluate the impact of a targeted workforce development program and how that can make the business case for the anchor institutions to later on take ownership of how to continue to support and fund these types of programs. I think, foundations, I know that we're going to talk a little bit later about the role. One of them is seed funding, but we certainly need the anchor institutions to take ownership of this work. Connections, which I've already referred to between the two sectors, but also different players. And then one of the things that I would say about our collaborative is that we want to be like a think and do tank. We've heard after convenings that we've deemed successful because of the number of attendees and the momentum and the energy that you can feel in the room, that a lot of times you have a convening and then what? Nothing happens. So what we've been able to do, despite the fact that we haven't formally launched this collaborative or network, is that we've been implementing projects along the way. And so, yes, we have convened and have been able to educate others during different communication vehicles, but we have also been working with some of the anchor institutions that have been that early adopter to get tangible examples that we can go and present back to the community. Because one of the challenges is that this is very hard to explain what this work is about. And so having those success stories along the way has been, I think, very important.
Cool. Would you be interested in sharing some, one major accomplishment and one significant head-banging, head-scratching challenge that you confront in this work?
One challenge? Really?
Just one.
Really?
Well, there are many.
Just one.
We could explore those in greater detail. Some Q&A, but yes.
I'll jump in. I think one of the accomplishments that I look fondly on is the creation of a job training program that 10 of the institutions came together to help create. So about 3 years ago, the institutions, this was prompted by some available resources that the city was making available that came from the state, that came from the feds. The institutions, through discussion, found that they shared a common need in having administrative assistants that fit both the hospital side as well as the higher education institution side. So the institutions came together, led by Hopkins and led by the University of Maryland, Baltimore, approached one of the larger nonprofits in the workforce space in Baltimore, Humanum, to pull together a proposal. The institutions committed to be a part of the steering committee, to be a part of job shadowing, job coaching, conducting mock interviews with the candidates. And they received funding from the city to create the program. Initially, the first year, the program served 75 individuals, and then we scaled it to 45 and then 30, focusing in on jobs within the institution. So in the second year of the program, 30 individuals participated, 27 graduated, and 26 were placed in jobs within the institutions. And so the program has gone on to get ongoing funding from the state through a workforce job training program. The institutions can be actively involved in the work. A third round is currently underway, cohorts of 15 at a time, moving the work forward. So it's an opportunity where the hiring power of one institution wasn't enough to support the training program, but the hiring power of 10 could make this happen, and making sure that you're not putting people in a situation where you're training them with no jobs, that you're at the end of the day, but you're training them in ensuring that there's job opportunities. Challenges, there's many challenges in this work. I have some scars, but you have to take the work on as Patrick described it, as well as Ted, in that you have to learn from the work. Our work has been highly influenced by the work that's unfolded in Cleveland, in Detroit, in New Orleans, in Newark, in Denver, in Memphis, other cities that have taken this on, trying to avoid some of the challenges in how do you bring this work to an implementation role, how do you bring people together, how do you keep the work going. I think one of the things that we're stuck on and trying to figure out and trying to move forward with is collective purchasing. And Cleveland's been able to do that. A few other cities have been able to do it. One of our institutions has enough buying power to do it on their own and attract businesses to Baltimore based on their buying power. So we're trying to figure out, we've got state schools on one side. They've got pretty strict regulatory process. Probably have to steer clear of that. We've got some very small private schools. So how do we put the buying power together and do more to either help support business development in Baltimore with existing businesses, not just sort of one-off contracts here and there, but also think about how do you attract businesses. So work ahead, certainly, for sure, but there's definitely lots of challenges.
So in terms of, I guess, the one accomplishment that I would share is that the Health Foundation, when we started this work, it was a lonely journey. And the accomplishment has been that over the past 2 years, we've been able to not only increase awareness, but influence other funders. And that means that we've been able to co-invest with other funders, but banks specifically, that are using their community development dollars. Our dollars obviously are limited, and we would not have been able to, let's say, support projects within Florida International University, which has been the recipient of over $500,000 from both the Health Foundation and Citi and JP Morgan to support two projects which I would highlight. One is a procurement project that allows the university system to update their procurement. Believe it or not, one of the challenges within this institution for the small businesses was that they were not aware of opportunities that FIU was putting out in terms of their RFPs, and it was because they didn't have their correct addresses, because they still went by a manual input system. So a small business would have to call up the university, leave a message if they didn't get an answer from the appropriate person, days later get back, and they would have to manually input that into the system. The new system would allow them to have the small businesses go in and do it themselves, something as simple as that. And then they have been also working on creating an incubation program that works with a cohort of 10 small businesses that are aligned with some of their largest spend categories to increase their capacity. And it's not just for the benefit of this one university, but they will be obviously training them so that they can do business with other anchors. The other is a workforce development program that JP Morgan is a co-investor with the Health Foundation, where they're working with two hospital systems to have a targeted workforce pipeline that really is about creating a certificate program for mid-level career jobs. And that's just getting underway, but we're participating in terms of the research as part of making that business case for anchors to in the future invest themselves, because at the end of the day, if we can show their cost savings, there's less staff turnover, and you're providing a pipeline of individuals that have the right skill set for the jobs that are vacant, then wouldn't that be the benefit that the anchor institution is looking for? In terms of challenges, obviously being more in the infancy or earlier stages of development, I think it's about who can convey what Ted basically said in his presentation in 2 minutes. When you're meeting with a CEO, their attention span is this, and also with other key stakeholders. So I would say, marketing and branding, or just going through a communications exercise with a professional that will help you kind of in a concise way, talk better about what this work is about would be critical. And I know I'm mixing this with one of our lessons learned, but I would have done this earlier on because, they want objectives. How does this compare to my other competing priorities? For many of these institutions, this is definitely not at the top of their list, especially when they're dealing with, some external political factors and other staff turnover or transitions, which is another challenge, staff transition. Long-term change, this is systems change, and we know we have to be here for the long haul. You have your key champion, everything is going well, and all of a sudden you have transition. And so it's like starting over, making the case for this type of work, which is, I guess, where MOUs and pledge would come in handy. But it doesn't matter. It's ongoing relationship building, and you have to keep that in mind.
I'm going to answer this more from the perspective of our emerging anchor network rather than the institutions on the network. There have been a number of successes and of course, some challenges that have been identified within the members of the network, but I'm thinking about this more from kind of a network organizing perspective right now. I would say that the first really demonstrable, tangible impact that the network has had is that one of the institutions in the network decided that, and it's the state university system, the Denver campus, the downtown Denver campus, decided that they could not get at procurement because there's 4 campuses that are part of the University of Colorado system, which is called CU for something reason instead of UC, because that all had to be done centrally, and central is Boulder, not Denver. So they were like, well, we can't do anything, and so we suggested, as a result of things we'd seen happening in other places, that they look at what they did have control over, and that they start small with things that they could influence. And so one of the folks at this Denver campus realized is that they all have their own, small P. They call them P cards. They're procurement cards. They're credit cards, but they have a fair bit of spending authority within that, within the use of those cards. So we worked as a network with that institution and the event planners who work within the many different schools within the University of Colorado at Denver to organize a catering fair that would bring together 11 emerging caterers who had small businesses, almost all of them owned by people of color and almost all of them owned by immigrants. And we worked on the back end as the network to make sure that they were ready to compete for and to provide the invoicing and to do the billing and to do all the structure that they needed, sort of to Kurt's point about the supply side, to be able to quickly meet the needs of the the event planners at the different institutions, and then circulated the invitation for that tasting event, which is what it turned out to be, to the rest of the event planners in the network. And so we ended up having this great event on November 9th where event planners, about 20 of them from institutions throughout our network, came together and just were blown away by the presentations of the food around the room from these different folks. All of them had their business cards out. All of them had their ways to purchase from them. How much lead time do they need? So we could segment and say, well, if you're planning a month ahead and you really want Peruvian food, you can go here. But if you need something tomorrow, you're going to have to go with this caterer because they're set up and have access to a commissary kitchen in a different way. So all of that information was kind of packaged and handed to them, and the orders are starting to roll in. So that was a really strong success that I think the network was able to accomplish, and it was small. It got small. When they started looking at this CU Denver, which includes this medical campus that I referred to earlier, they found out that in 2018 so far, they had ordered $340,000 worth of lunches from, wait for it, Panera. That one institution, 250,000 of that came from the medical campus. That's a lot of money in the pockets of immigrant caterers who are struggling to make a business, who make really good food, and who have, if they had the access to expand their capacity, could be employing people, and whose own families could be advanced tremendously by the opportunity to receive even a portion of those contracts. That's Panera. I mean, what about the other ones that are out there? So really great opportunity to open people's eyes that the network, I think, was able to accomplish. I would say the biggest challenge that we've had in the network is getting the right people in the room when we start talking about, for instance, local hiring, local procurement. Each of these institutions has procurement officers, and they have supply chains, and each of the hiring areas, like you go to Ansys Medical Campus, each of the institutions on the campus has its own hiring manager. They don't talk to each other. They're not invested in this. They got a job opening, they want to get it filled as quickly as they can with a qualified candidate. They're not hearing the message that you should actually be hiring from the local job hub, which is preparing residents of the community around the campus for jobs on your campus. They want to solve that problem. And so we need them in the room, and we need the big P procurement folks in the room. Right now, we've got the folks who are interested in sort of community engagement on behalf of the institutions, and they don't necessarily have the flex to, the power to pull those, to the chief of procurement for their institution or the university into the room. So that's been a real challenge, and we're actively working to solve that this year. Stay tuned.
So we have about 10 minutes left in this session, and I have a bunch more questions, but I would like to open it up to you at this point, because I'm sure this has sort of sparked some further insights and the desires for information from our panelists. So, yes.
Okay, so this question in particular is for Kurt. I guess in Baltimore, have you guys begun to think about strategies as in regards to addressing the opportunity zones and exactly what that could look like with the large influx of capital? I guess that'd be coming down the pike. So,
I have not been directly involved. Our city partners are managing that, and they hired someone to manage the city opportunity zone strategy across the city. I believe there are 42 opportunity zones that have popped up through dialogue set initially by the city and then endorsed by the state. They abut and are scattered, abut a lot of the institutions and the community partners near the institutions. In the capital space, we're finding that the institutions can play a very important role in moving catalytic projects forward, some which could be funded by opportunity zones. We're finding that the institutions are we're having the best dialogue with communities about opportunities around their campuses are a part of community-based partnerships. So there's a citywide partnership of the anchor institutions. There are neighborhood-based partnerships that many of the institutions are involved in that include 2 or 3 institutions, 10 neighborhoods, and a range of other partners, and they focus on geography issues and challenges that are pertinent to that area. And so I believe some of the opportunity zone conversations and opportunities to push forward development projects are coming out of that dialogue as well. We're a city that has lost a third of its population over the last 50 years. There's lots of opportunity for reinvestment. It's going to be a competitive process for those projects to unfold, and I suspect the institutions will be playing a role in some of those projects as those regulations and the opportunity ultimately comes forward.
It's trickier than it seems, doesn't it? Yeah.
Release it. Oh, okay. So in Denver, you mentioned a community conversation that seemed to inform some of the work that you're doing. My question is, how do the people you're trying to impact actually inform the work? How does their experience, what's the mechanism for their experience on the ground trickle up to the people making these decisions? What does that look like?
It's a great question and something that we're very concerned about and really where we started with this work because of our work in our Strengthening Neighborhoods program. So when the Community Campus Partnership, which is, I indicated, our first partner at this medical campus got started, they had assembled a team of folks who they wanted to work on this, and they had some funding from the institutions on the campus. And they came to us to ask if we could help build out some of their staff. And we said, we will do that provided that our funding is directed at hiring a community organizer. And so that was the way they got our funding. They also wanted our funding so they could go to their C-suite folks and say, we've got this community foundation. It's not just all your resources. We're bringing in money from outside as well. And so with that, we helped them launch their community connect. They ended up calling the person a community connector, not an organizer, but she was a trained organizer who came out of one of our local organizing networks. And she built something called the Resident Leaders Council, which was very intentional and which spent its first 6 months after it assembled a group of local mostly immigrant, but and a lot of young people from the community together in learning how to do one-to-ones and going out into the community and doing one-to-ones broadly within their networks. They did 400 conversations after they were trained in those first few months. And then they rolled all of that data up to a high-level presentation that they were then trained and helped to present to the C-suite folks that we had engaged. And they were able to say to them, in this community, here's the issues that rose to the top. Number one, jobs. We don't know what's happening on that campus. We know you employ thousands of people, and we don't have any idea how to get access to those jobs. And number two was our educational system. Aurora Public Schools, where this sits, is one of the lowest performing districts in the state. We are deeply concerned about our kids' access to education when we have these high-class, world-class educational institutions in the whole STEM world sitting right here in our community. And that then defined the conversation with the institutions about how the Community Campus Partnership structure and priorities were going to roll out. And so that has been incredibly important. At Regis University, a Jesuit university in Denver, they also came to us after they got involved in the Denver Anchor Network and said, what can we do to get started? Can you help us with some grant funding? And we said, we'll do that if you hire a community organizer. And so they've used that to create a community council, which Regis had never interacted with the community in that way before. Everything was always very top-down. They did charrettes if they were developing in the community, but it was already determined by the architects, and they were just sharing information. So we said, look, community council has to be people from the neighborhood who have a two-way dialogue with the university about how it's interacting with the surrounding community. And from that, we'll get to what your anchor strategy is going to be. So those were two techniques that we tried.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yes.
There's a lot of talk, of course, about procurement and things like that. Two topics that I haven't heard much about, and I'm just curious if I'm not saying that they're the most relevant or the most impactful necessarily, but I'm curious if they've come up around the tables and how you've contemplated them. One that strikes me as housing, and the other is crime. So I'm curious if either of those things have been addressed or contemplated, reprioritized in any way.
I'll jump in. So there are some examples of both in Baltimore. We have a hospital, I think it's the only one in the country, Bon Secours, and their work is covered by the Democracy Collaborative's research. They have become a community development entity in West Baltimore. Through the years, they have now built and now own over 800 units of affordable housing. And I think they're the only hospital in the country in that position. They have also crafted a range of workforce development strategies to complement that work. They serve about 1,000 individuals a year through a range of different programming on the workforce side. So Bon Secours, a great example to look at. They're covered in a lot of literature on the anchor institution strategy. On the crime front, I will attest that Baltimore has it's a tough topic. We tend to be in the top 5 in murder rate in the country. And the crime issue is what drives the attention of a lot of institutions to recognize that there's more they can do to support needs in the city. That for them to attract students, faculty, staff, to have a competitive business model, they have to see a healthy city and healthy neighborhoods around them. And so a variety of things are continuing to unfold. It depends on which part of the city. One institution has expanded their public safety officers to include neighborhoods around their campus, and so expanding the patrols. Some institutions and community partners are working on joint crime strategies where they're mapping out hot spots in the neighborhoods. They're working on video cameras, so a range of different approaches. But the crime public safety issue drives the attention of a lot of the institutions and is a big value proposition for them in moving these kinds of strategies forward, which are seen as preventive strategies to crime.
Just to add, affordable housing is becoming the #1 priority issue across the board in South Florida. None of our hospitals have really been engaged in those discussions, but where we have seen an opportunity to get them engaged is in workforce housing, right? Because I think they are engaged in that type of activity, but what we're trying to introduce is this idea of inclusionary zoning and having them be part of policy discussions with the local municipalities around how we can, if you build workforce housing, would you set aside a certain percentage for other residents that are not necessarily employees? One of our largest nonprofit hospital system in South Florida, they're getting into that space as a event. It's become an interest to them actually because of what happened in Monroe County with the hurricane, where one of the hospitals was completely destroyed and a lot of their employees' homes were destroyed. And so now they're thinking how they can provide housing and get into that, being a developer for workforce housing. So sometimes it's about sensing opportunities and how perhaps it's not what they would like. I mean, we've heard some hospital stakeholders say, well, I don't want affordable housing adjacent to the hospital because I want my doctors and other employees to be, comfortable living in this community. So those are the types of things that will come up in conversations. But, again, it's kind of culture change, which is not easy.
I would add one other point. Many of our institutions have turned to live near work strategies, where they're providing down payment assistance to their employees. They range from $2,500 to, at one point, Hopkins was offering about $35,000 to support employees' efforts to buy a home in targeted neighborhoods. Often those dollars are matched by or supplemented by the city and sometimes the state. So there's different kinds of strategies when you think about housing too.
And one other thing, we tend to think of universities as bastions of privilege, but one of the challenges that is emerging, particularly in high-cost housing markets on the West Coast in particular, that the percentage of homeless students is significant, in some cases in the high single digits. And that is now, I think, prompting a number of universities in these markets to think about their students, and especially their lower and more modestly compensated staff, and how you go about providing housing for them as well. I think we're out of time, but I think I could speak for the group, is that we love talking about this, and we would welcome, any additional questions that you might have, either in the remainder of today or offline. So thank you very much.
And one quick plug, I'm sorry. We put a report together this summer that catalogs about 30 economic inclusion strategies that have unfolded. We interviewed business leaders that are moving this work forward, as well as higher education and hospital representatives, to talk about some of the lessons learned. And the report makes the business case for economic inclusion in Baltimore, that institutions can tackle this work without negatively impacting their bottom line, and that there's benefits for both community, of course, but also the institutions that take this work on. So on our website, www.baltimorepartnership.org.
So that's not on the table.
No.
Thank you to our panel. Thank you, Charles, Denise, Patrick. So before we take a quick break, and break does not mean go break to your car. It means come back for a facilitated discussion of that our list partners are going to do. And this is really the important piece, because this starts the conversation on how we can begin to think about and strategize and what's already being done in Kansas City as far as anchor collaboratives, missions, what work is taking place right now. So before we do a stretch break, or during our stretch break, I'm going to show a video. Janice sent me a video last night of getting those CEOs, like Ted talked about, on camera saying they would do this anchor work. So I'm going to show a video from the Health Foundation of South Florida.
In Miami-Dade County, 58% of households are either living in poverty or are having to make difficult decisions on whether to pay for their rent, food, transportation, childcare, and healthcare. Health Foundation of South Florida is committed to improving community health, and we simply can't achieve that mission if we don't address the social and the economic circumstances in which people live. The goal of the Anchor Institution Initiative at the Foundation is to partner with our local institutions, such as hospitals and universities, which are our largest employers and purchaser of goods and services, to use our economic power for the long-term benefit of our community.
This university has, from its very origins in 1925, been deeply rooted in its community. And we are proud to serve that role of being an anchor institution, which we do both in terms of our academic mission, but very importantly, we are a large organization. We generate a lot of jobs locally, and through our procurement practices, we can actually stimulate small, local, minority-owned businesses.
Anchor institutions have been key for the success of Half Moon Empanadas. We started our company in a 2,000 square feet location in South Beach that never made money. And so, out of survival, we started to look for opportunities to sell our empanadas. And it was really by luck, when I was offering the empanadas to the University of Miami for catering, that the guy mentioned that they had a cart in a building. And, I said, I'll try it. And we understood the value that being in a university like the University of Miami or FIU brings to the business. It's really when we understood that that's where the business was going to grow.
An anchor institution means that regardless of what else happens, the institution will be present. The institution will be leaning in to help the community. And we feel very strongly about that role, and we're very proud of it. Small and medium-sized businesses are the backbone of our community. They've got to prosper. If they prosper, the community prospers. We're particularly proud of Misha's, we're proud of Vicky's, we're proud of Half Moon Empanadas. What they've accomplished in a short period of time is nothing short of miraculous and exemplifies what we're capable of in this community.
By our own procurement practices that may help local, small, minority-owned businesses prosper, we start dealing with creating the conditions of prosperity that are actually fundamental to improving health.
Anchor institutions have a major impact in our community, and sometimes in ways that we don't even think about. The story of Half Moon Empanadas is just one prime example. We need to make sure that we have a pipeline of businesses that are going to be ready to take advantage of the opportunities that anchor institutions provide. And this is where incubator programs like Startup FIU Food come into play.
We're passionate about building bridges into the community, and Startup FIU, our food incubator as well, are great examples of success stories where local companies can come in and build themselves into success.
The idea for Startup FIU actually came about from FIU recognizing that they had resources that were not tapped into. We actually have a commercial kitchen space at our Biscayne Bay campus that's about 3,000 square feet. And one of our leaders recognized that the space was actually only used 20% of the time. And so we decided to open up these resources to our community. And in order to actually launch this initiative, we partnered with City Foundation, providing our commercial kitchen space and the educational components that could help companies within South Florida scale.
My experience working with anchor institutions, it's been transformational. The University of Miami card allows to understand our new business model, and then the airport location really allows to scale. I mean, after the airport location, our sales skyrocket. We were able to hire more people. We were a company of 10 employees. Now we're a company of 50 employees.
The response from the community has been overwhelming. We actually have way more small businesses asking for assistance from FIU regarding Startup FIU Food than we anticipated, because we also have purchasing power. We can also become customers to our small businesses.
The true economic impact of a university is measured by the way it contributes to a vibrant, dynamic economy, and by the way it contributes to the social connectivity, the idea that everyone can feel included. So it's both social cohesion and economic prosperity. And those two actually define a vibrant community.
Health Foundation has high expectations for our community, and they help us to raise the bar on the kinds of programs and services that we can provide. I'm very proud of the partnership we have with the Health Foundation of South Florida.
We look forward to collaborating with Health Foundation of South Florida and other partners to improve this community that we all call home.
Our vision is to make Miami the healthiest community in the nation, but we simply can't do it alone. It's going to take all who call Miami home to work together.
Right, or a short film. So we'll take about a 5-minute break. If you are not located at a table, we ask you to move to a table so that you can become a part of the facilitated conversation. So about a 5-minute break, and we'll resume at 11 o'clock. local programs by investing in people, places, and businesses. Under Bill's leadership, LISC Indianapolis invested over $240 million to leverage $1 billion of investments in the core urban neighborhoods of Indianapolis. Prior to that, Bill served as president of Southeast Neighborhood Development for 14 years, overseeing the early phases of revitalization for the Fountain Square area of Indianapolis. Please help me welcome Bill Taft as he'll facilitate our discussion.
Well, good morning. Thanks for the opportunity to join you here in Kansas City. I had the pleasure yesterday of spending some time with our local director, Stephen Samuels, and his staff, touring some of the great work that's happening here in the city. And our organization is Local Initiative Support Corporation, so I think it's appropriate that my job here is to kind of transition the conversation to what does this mean for Kansas City. We are, and also to give you a little bit of an overview of what this kind of looks like in other places where we have, sure I get this going here, where LISC has partnered with local organizations to really follow up on these three basic strategy areas of district development or place strategies, investing in a business infrastructure that is inclusive and equitable, in how anchor institutions invest, and then investing in pathways for people from the communities to connect to employment opportunities with anchor organizations. So one of the things that LISC does is really work on this issue of how do we mobilize capital and connect it to communities. And one of the things Ted mentioned was that there's a natural power imbalance between anchor institutions and community there are disinvested communities that are often adjacent to them. And so when there's an effort like this to connect to communities, often there's a need for, I think Ted called it a catalytic agent, of an organization that can actually be involved in helping to make that a healthy, dynamic, and effective partnership. And I'm going to give you some examples of other cities where LISC has played that role of linking anchors to community-based organizations that are longtime partners. One in the area of district development, this is idea that there are places, often the places where the anchors actually sit, that the future of that place really affects both the community and the anchor. And there's a variety, I won't go into all the details of the return on investment, but clearly there are benefits to the anchors and to the community for this work. One example of this is actually Bon Secours was mentioned earlier, but this is their work in Richmond, Virginia, where the local LISC program worked with them to establish a partnership around a commercial district that was disinvested and linking those businesses to the anchor, but most importantly, helping those businesses become stronger and grow to serve that community as well. And that's a partnership that has grown through the years and now is in multiple commercial districts with multiple anchor institutions sort of adopting the small businesses in that area and participating in programs that strengthen their capacities as organizations and certainly spend in those districts. Also, this idea of procurement or basic is really a more broad conversation of strengthening businesses that are in disinvested communities and increasing their ability to hire from those communities is ultimately often a goal. And also, but helping them be a stronger business to be able to then connect to those anchors effectively and then obviously have the relationships with the folks that are making those decisions with the anchors. Again, that's a work of small business investment, capacity building, networking, building partnerships, processes, and again, it takes often an intermediary of some sort, and probably multiple intermediaries to make that happen. And then finally, this idea of, one example of this is actually in Northeastern University in Boston, where they worked with around this question of how do they spend their procurement dollars and how do they strengthen the local market. They actually created a $25 million fund to provide capital for growth of businesses in the neighborhoods surrounding that institution. And they partnered with LISC to be able to manage that fund. And I think we talk about lessons learned, and so one of the things we've learned is that just because there is capital available doesn't mean that it's going to be utilized, and there are a lot of technical assistance and capacity building needs out there for businesses to be able to take advantage of these kinds of opportunities. And Boston is one of those places where we're learning those lessons and growing through that, but definitely is an example of that really creates, requires rather, a strong ecosystem of small business lenders, technical assistance, capacity building organizations, as well as healthy relationships with anchors and processes to connect to their procurement folks to be able to really make these connections happen. Finally, in workforce development, or this idea of where do anchors hire from and how do we create pathways for them to hire from their communities around them, is a key strategy, really often one of the early things where you can really make progress quickly, even though it's over time is an ongoing challenge to make this effective. A great example of this work is in Toledo, Ohio. ProMedica and also Mercy Health are two hospital networks there that I think mentioned earlier that often these are major competitors with each other, but they came together to work with LISC and some community-based organizations that run financial opportunity centers, which are also here in Kansas City, to create a training program specifically crafted with the input from the anchor institutions to actually basically equip people with the skills from the community necessary to then enter into a job pathway that will move people up through additional upskilling once they start working for the hospitals. And also, part of this program is each of those financial opportunity centers are also placing a coach with these anchor institutions, so they're supporting those employees after they're hired to help them be successful, and to also do things like build their credit, make sure they're accessing banking services at a reasonable cost, et cetera, to make them more financially successful, and because of that, more stable as employees for those anchor institutions. So the question is, what does this look like here? There's really this, again, this is a challenge that is not just a question of anchors and their neighborhoods. It's an ecosystem of organizations here and from getting a sense of who's in the room, which we're going to talk a little bit more later on, it's all of you would have to have a role for this to be effective. And so the question is where do you start? What are the roles of the organizations? And who are the willing that are going to make these first steps forward? We heard about the different levels of progress that are being made and the different ways that different communities start to address this challenge in a different way because of the conditions and the partners that are there. And so this will be unique in Kansas City as you make progress. And so I think our goal for this next few minutes and for the remainder of our time here is to really talk about together what does that look like here. So when you at each of your tables, you will have a conversation about to answer a few key questions. And each of these questions really go back to the beginnings of shaping a local strategy. There really are, I think when you look underneath these questions, what they start to suss out are those questions of who, what, and why, and how. And so the first one that we're going to all look at, and again, this is all at your table, but let's talk a little bit about what these questions are, is how are you already engaging in the three anchor strategies? So this place-based work, supporting businesses, as well as hiring as the three basic categories of work. What's already happening here? Obviously, I would imagine that there are already efforts along these lines in Kansas City. So we want to identify what those are, and the best way to do that is sort of crowdsource that information. So we'll ask each of you at each of your tables to identify what you know about where this is already happening here. All that will be gathered up later and will be aggregated and used to plan, okay, what are the next steps as we go from here? Then also, what support is necessary to move those forward more effectively? And then secondly, and thirdly, rather, what are the next steps that really we should be taking as a community to move these things forward? And so that conversation, we really want that to be organic. We want to have you take have as much time as you can. So we'll just have a few minutes at the very end where Ina, also from the The LISC staff here is going to close this out and sort of summarize what came out of your table discussions. At each one of your tables, you have a facilitator who will help you kind of walk through these questions, and we are really excited to see what comes out of each of these, and then we'll be pulled together. And I believe the team of organizations here, which would be the LISC and the Federal Reserve Bank and the Chamber and the city, and also Kaufman, I think, are the partners here that supported this event. Will then kind of look at what you come up with and think through, okay, what are the next steps and how do we reconvene in the right format to move those forward. But really, again, most importantly now, we want to hear what's already going on and not assume that everybody knows what's happening and then what the opportunity to make progress is. So did I miss anything as far as facilitation here? Great. Thanks.
Sorry, folks, if I could have your attention for 1 sec. I see so much vibrant conversation going on, but little note-taking. So I just encourage you to write down some key points if you can. There's flip charts on the table so that we can collect them. Thanks. So I get the lucky job of interrupting everybody and bringing us back together. So if you hear my voice, I'm going to slowly direct you to the front of the room. Oh my gosh, it worked. Sorry to interrupt. I'm so excited to see all of the conversation going on at all the tables. And so definitely want to take a moment to hear from each of you and just to get maybe a few key points. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Ina Anderson with Greater Kansas City Local Initiative Support Corporation and part of the group that worked to put this event together today. So just want to go around and get from each table really just maybe 3 key points, maybe in each of the areas that was discussed. And I'm going to start with my table way back down there with Dr. Wagner so that we can model for you how succinctly we can get this done. So Jake, if you want to go ahead and just a few key points of what we heard.
Okay. So Jacob Wagner from UMKC. First is better knowledge of what's actually happening in our region in terms of the existing institutions and what they're already working on, not assuming that, none of this is happening, but we saw a very sort of holistic presentation where there's lots of different sectors of how this can be applied. So what are people already doing? How can we build from those successes and strengths? So whether it's purchasing power or food purchasing or procurement or workforce development or other categories, transportation, these kinds of things, making sure we know what the institutions are actually doing. And then from there, I think also thinking about leadership to actually accomplish the next level. So we talked a lot about maybe the next sort of phase of this sort of local movement would be have maybe like 5 key leaders from 5 different sectors say, hey, we're going to do this. So, someone from the cultural sector, someone from a hospital or health related institution, from university, et cetera, would actually say, hey, we're going to do our own analysis of our own practices and how that's impacting the community now. And we're going to sort of demonstrate best practices by looking at ourselves and then saying, hey, we can all do this. We can have an impact in these important ways. So really sort of the leadership around, really understanding what the institutions are doing, but also what could be done better. And then sort of some ideas around that in terms of next steps. Okay?
That's great. And I'll just add, because I was at that table, that really starting with the data analysis, we thought was a really good first step. And that we know that there's some folks that are working on this already. So like Casey Rising and Mark, and making sure that we are Civic Council, that we're bringing those folks into the conversation as we move forward. Who would like to go next? Any volunteers? Steve Weatherford.
All right. Here at our table, we started out really kind of talking about some of the things that are happening around the city. We initially focused on the historic Northeast and the Choice Neighborhood Initiative. Certainly by having someone here from the Housing Authority, we really got an insight into some of the things that are happening there. New housing, some of the activities along Independence. Bobby shared with us some of the new businesses that are now springing up as a result of those activities. One of the interesting things, one of the comments, though, was about one of the anchor institutions. We know that Kansas City University is there, located in the historic Northeast, and the impact of the university and the serving as an anchor institution that is supporting some of these initiatives, we think there is an opportunity there to really have them become much more of an impact. So feeling more comfortable in that neighborhood and taking on that role and that responsibility, I think is something that we really focused on. Another thing I will mention, our presentation today, we had all of the big anchor institutions that were mentioned, the universities, the hospitals, all of the big players And what we talked about was maybe there is also an opportunity, especially here in our community, to identify the medium players, the smaller anchor institutions, our churches, the YMCA, on the East Patrol facility, along Prospect. So we really felt like that this isn't just getting the big players to have an impact, but also to identify who the other anchor institutions in our community. We also believe that one of the key components that we heard and that we really would like to see more here in Kansas City is more resources for our small business initiatives. To really work with those resources to get them penetrating into the neighborhood so that we have more minority-owned, women-owned business opportunities, and that we have resources that can support them. So, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Treese, calling on you, your table.
All right. I'll try to focus this way so our online viewers can chime in. So we were pretty similar. The one thing that I'll add that I think that kind of ties back to what Ted was talking about earlier, a lot of this is somewhat collective impact versus anchor institutions. And one of the big things that kind of came out for me was that there's a strong need in Kansas City around collective impact. And so we talked about a lot of the different programs that are going on and possibly being worked on individually and a little bit siloed. And how do we come together and work together on those initiatives and learn a little bit more about them and being able to partner from a common theme. We talked a lot about Janice's example of having a easy, short way to express what is our end goal and a way of working together. So that was one of the biggest pieces for this group, talking a little bit about doing an exercise as a next step to keep things going so that all the partners really can kind of see like what is the reason why we're in the table and the value add for us to all work together. So I'll stop right there. There's a lot more that we'll include in the notes.
Chris and Margot, y'all.
Oh,
It's all about the release.
All about the release. Okay. All right. So I'd like to build on, we talked about many of the same issues that you all have already addressed. I think one important thing that we discussed that was just mentioned was that there are many collaboratives and collective impact pieces going on that the anchor institution becomes, you have the clout of those large institutions who are really looking more closely at the impact of their day-to-day existence on the community and the partnerships and the work. And we saw that as a very important distinction. And it doesn't, having an anchor institution strategy does not stop the collaboratives from happening. That the collaboratives are more issue-based, are more focused on specific subjects and outcomes. For the anchor institution is really about how those institutions day in and day out carry their work with participating in the community. There are a couple of other areas that we addressed that were really important, that in developing these anchor institution strategies, it's very important to find the right leaders and that it can't be for those that are faint of heart, that we need to have leaders who are willing to be able to day in and day out do the work they need to do inside their institutions, across different institutions, and then out and relating to the community so that they can remove some of the barriers, they can provide the vision and really the execution of getting this work off the ground, because we all acknowledged at our table this is a different way of working and a different way of how different outcomes, and it's a long-term process. It's a marathon, not a 5K, though I've never done either one of those. And we also, it's not too late, right? No, I've heard I can still do that, so yeah. So we also addressed that research and data is really important from the start and to engage and to better understand what some of the challenges, what you're currently doing, what you could do,
but also along the process that you must have mechanisms to really understand what the bottom line is for the institutions. And then in moving forward, we felt that having convenings and having the right type of convenings were really important. I think the first group that presented talked about making certain that we have the right individuals at the table to really closely look at. There are some nascent efforts that are already going on with the Health Sciences District that really could be a fruitful balancing point for some of the healthcare institutions and higher education to think differently, and what do they need to do to look at the anchor pieces. So anything else from the table I missed?
Thank you, Margot.
Great. How do you shut this off?
Okay, Amanda and Jeremy, I think you each have 1 minute. Amanda, that's
Okay,
a real...
so we had some that we hit mostly just the existing collaborations that are going on. So what was interesting, I think, at our table is that there are already existing collaborations going on around geographic areas, the Health Science District, not Hospital Hill, and then institution types with the Kansas City Museum and other small to mid-size cultural institutions in Kansas City, as well as then geographic areas, so around the Kauffman Foundation and around the Moore Institute, UMKC, the Art Museum. And so there's these collaboratives already happening for different purposes, but mostly around to do their work better, for more of their own kind of internal strength, building and sharing resources. Correct me if I'm wrong. Also, there's a lot of work already where the institutions are already involved in the community, whether it's mobile clinics, a new mobile clinic starting, working with surrounding neighborhoods. So some of that work already exists. And then there's a great opportunity, which Kansas City Museum would love to push, is that cultural institutions being more involved here. Especially in their case, they're really collecting the stories and experiences of beings of all types, colors, immigration status, everything. So that is could be really key in, I think, informing and then building all of this work.
Thanks, Amanda. Sorry,
Okay.
it's 12, so I'm going to keep us moving. Jeremy, do you have a quick?
All right, so I'll try and make this quick with the highlights that haven't been hit on yet. One of the big takeaways for me was recognizing the need to align objective and the return on investment and benefit to the institution or institutions. We had conversation just even within an existing institution, the differences between what your financial and procurement and legal and other areas, they may not all be aligned for the greater goal necessarily. Secondly, the idea of institutional support is something that's needed. There are some existing programs and initiatives that sometimes might be under-resourced financially, but also both politically within the organization. And so having that buy-in and support at various levels, as well as some financial support. One question that came up is, how do we get the community to see that these initiatives are done as part of corporate social responsibility and not just for financial benefit? Especially for an example of a bank, seeing that they have some initiatives and opportunities, and they're doing it because they care about the community, and it's not just trying to make a buck. Finally, there's discussion that there's a lot of opportunity for anchor institutions to recognize that a lot of their own employees might be low or moderate income, and things they can do from an employee assistance perspective. We talked a lot of financial resources, affordable housing assistance, a lot of ways that employers could help their employees just by sharing with them effectively some resources, some financial coaching, some homebuyer assistance, and other programs that could help their employees.
Well, thank you so much. We've come to the end of our time, and I really want to stick to that. So I will just wrap up by thanking Chantel and the Fed Reserve and our other partners who helped put this together, including the Kauffman Foundation. Gloria is still here, John Jenks from the Chamber, Therese Booz from LISC. I think that's everybody. John Wood from the City of Kansas City. we've come together as sort of a steering committee, kind of like initiated by the Fed Reserve's strategy here. And we'll plan to continue doing that. And we plan to continue having these conversations. This is just the beginning. We hope that you take the information that you've learned here today, and thank you to all the speakers that came in from out of town to share their expertise with us. We want to invite you to join us in this conversation since we don't know it all. There are feedback forms on your tables that are going to be really important to us understanding how to continue this conversation. We're committed to holding some more convenings early in the year. The idea right now is to do those by sector, so to bring together the hospital folks for a half day, to bring together the universities for a half day. I'm hearing that potentially we might need to add one for cultural institutions or figure out ways to bring them into this conversation as well, and also city and municipal folks. So that's the idea right now, but we're looking for your feedback to help inform what the agenda and what those meetings look like, because we need to adapt those to really get y'all's buy-in and to make them useful as resources for the folks that take part. So if you're interested in helping to inform what these future convenings look like, please do reach out to Chantel or to me directly, put it on the feedback form, and we'll definitely would like to get as much buy-in on the future convenings as possible. I think that's it. Am I leaving anything else? Chantel, any other parting words? So thank you all for coming and staying and being so engaged. I'm really inspired, actually, by the number of folks that turned out and the commitment that everybody's showing to this. So, oh, and I will mention that Chantel and I will be coming to the Anchor Collaborative convening in New Orleans, so we hope to bring back a lot of that information as well. And thank you, Ted, for inviting us. Thanks.